Welcome to episode 47 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 30th of March 2025, and my guest today is Omer Taspinar. Omer Taspinar is a scholar, author, and policy expert specializing in Middle East politics, U.S. foreign policy, and Turkish affairs. He's a professor at the National Defense University and Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on the intersection of political economy, nationalism, and security in the Middle East, with a particular emphasis on Turkey. Professor Taspinar is the author of What the West is Getting Wrong About the Middle East, Why Islam is Not the Problem, published by IB Tauris in 2020, where he challenges prevailing Western narratives about the region. His work highlights the role of weak states, economic underdevelopment, and authoritarianism, rather than religion, as the primary drivers of instability and extremism. Today, we'll be discussing his book in minute detail. This episode is supported by the Arab Political Science Network. Welcome to Tahrir Podcast, Professor Taspinar. It's great to finally have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me.
Of course, welcome. So before we dive into it and to lay some ground for the further discussion to come, what inspired you to write this book in the first place? And what is the biggest misconception about the Middle East that you aim to correct?
Well, let me tell you from the beginning that this book, What the West is Getting Wrong About the Middle East, Why Islam is Not the Problem, was not the choice that I had for the title. But oftentimes when you write a book, you're at the mercy of your editors who believe that a more catchy title can capture what you want to say. The idea for this book has two different roots. One of them has to do with a class that I started teaching at Johns Hopkins SAIS right after 9/11. And it was called Islam in Europe. And I wanted to focus on Muslim minorities in Western Europe, particularly France, Germany, and United Kingdom. And I grew up in Turkey, but I also come from a family where my father was a diplomat. So I grew up traveling around, and I went to French school. So I spoke French. I was always interested in the similarities between France and Turkey. And so the idea of also writing something on Turkey was appealing. That's the other root of the book. And I pitched the idea to my editor on two grounds. I said, I've been teaching this course on Muslim minorities in Europe. And overall, there is a European Western obsession with identity, with the fact that there is something about Muslims and about Islam that is conducive to a rejection of maybe modernity, liberalism. It's as if there is this kind of a problem with Islam that is different than Christianity or Judaism, that there's so much emphasis on the need to understand the Muslim mindset, the need to read the Quran in order to understand Muslims. And in fact, I argued all the time that, if you want to understand Muslim communities in Europe, you have to understand the social, political, economic dynamics and not obsessively and exclusively focus on Islam and Muslim identity. And similarly with Turkey, I grew up in Turkey in the 1990s when I went to college at Middle East Technical University. There was this rise of political Islam in Turkey, and people were fascinated with an Islamist party, the Welfare Party, and then the party of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which was the reformed version of the Welfare Party. Called the Justice and Development Party. And there was this obsession with the Muslim identity of Turkey. Almost all discussions I had was about Islam versus secularism. And I got the sense that maybe the West does not understand that in what Erdogan is doing in Turkey, there's a lot of nationalism, and that he's able to actually transcend this kind of divide in Turkey. There are lots of people, secular, progressive, center-left people who actually voted for Erdogan in his first decade in power. He's been in power for now 22 years. And during his first 10 years, he was actually doing a lot of good things in Turkey in terms of improving Turkey's living standards, improving Turkish democracy, taking Turkey closer to the European Union. That was not about Islam. It was about good governance. It was about good economic, political performance, improvements in human rights and democracy. Then the last 10, 15 years of Erdogan has been backsliding towards more authoritarianism. And that too is not about Islam. It's more about authoritarianism. But there's this fascination in the West about looking at Turkey as East or West, Islam or secularism. And of course, it's colored by Orientalism, this neo-Orientalist mindset that wants to see Islam at the heart of all things. And I wanted to challenge that. And I mentioned to my editor that I want to write a book about Turkey, which emphasizes the power of nationalism in Erdogan's message, how he's able to mobilize the nationalist political culture of Turkey, something that appeals to both secularists and more pious segments. And that also the reason why he's winning elections in Turkey is not because he's an Islamist, that basically people are in love with the kind of conservative agenda that he has, but that actually, especially in his first 10, 15 years, income per capita tripled in Turkey. Infrastructure projects mushroomed. The health sector really proved very, very strong. People witnessed significant change in their living standards. A new middle class emerged. So let's understand the performance, the economic performance, the political performance, and the governance system. So my main goal was to emphasize in writing this book the role of non-Islamic factors, not culture, not identity, but governance as a kind of socio-economic, political phenomenon, and nationalism. And the editor liked the idea, but he said, wouldn't you want to write about the Middle East in general? Like, can you think about this dichotomy in larger terms? And I said, sure, I can see how there is a lot of emphasis on Islam in the way the Western world thinks about the Middle East, and it clouds the judgment, the assumptions. For instance, on the Sunni Shiite sectarian debate, there's this tendency to see this as a religious, theological problem, as a deeply rooted problem that started with the Prophet's succession. It's as if like the roots of the clash between Saudi Arabia and Iran today go back to the 7th century. And whenever I was reading that, I said, this is such a wrong understanding of what's going on in the Middle East today. If you want to understand what's going on in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, the last thing you should do is to start with basically the roots of Islam and the idea that you have to understand, the sectarian theological difference between Sunnis and Shiites. So I said, okay, I can write about the sectarian problem in the Middle East by focusing on governance, on weak states where the sectarian debate is taking place, the sectarian dimension, polarization is taking place in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, all either weak states or failing states, and also how nationalism is important. For Iran, it's a Persian nationalist framework. For Saudi Arabia, it's Arab nationalism. And so the Sunni Shiite dichotomy has a lot of, nationalist dimensions in it that the West does not pay much attention. So that created the book in the sense that now it was no longer just on Turkey, but it was also on Sunni Shiite divide. And as we will talk shortly, I added a third case study, which was about ISIS. And I had some experience about the Muslim communities in Europe, some of the, second or third generation, the alienated, the angry, frustrated Muslim youth who would join the jihadist movements. And I had always this belief, and my research and readings proved that this was not about Islam. It was oftentimes related to factors that had their roots in social, political, psychological phenomena, that the kids joining ISIS, the jihadists, oftentimes were not very well read. in Islam. They were not thinking about Islam. They were just people looking for adventure, people looking for an identity, rebels looking for a cause. And I wanted to prove that ISIS is also something that goes beyond just Islam, just jihadism. If you want to understand the emergence of ISIS and who joins ISIS from the West, you have to look at factors other than Islam, and also you have to understand where ISIS came from. Why did it emerge in Syria and Iraq? Was it just because there was a need for such radical jihadist Islam, or was it something related to the failure of the state, the collapse of the state in Syria and in Iraq? So it kind of fits into the governance model. And I also started to use the term Sunni nationalism, the Sunni identity, and the fact that there were a lot of Ba'athist soldiers from former Saddam army joining ISIS. Why would these Ba'athist generals, Ba'athist soldiers join ISIS? Ba'athism is a secular, almost socialist, nationalist ideology. Ba'athists are not Islamists. They're the enemies of political Islam. And why would Ba'athists join ISIS? So that was also an eye-opening research for me in terms of looking at Sunni nationalism feeding to ISIS and the kind of Sunni dispowerment, Sunni alienation, Sunni victimhood that fed the emergence of ISIS. So the book became, in that sense, a larger book that transcended Turkey, that started to look at Sunni Shiite sectarian divide and also ISIS as the third case study. That's the story of the book.
And before we handle each argument with a case study separately, you argue that Islam is not the core issue behind instability in the region. So what then are the real drivers of conflict, briefly, before we break them down, each one individually?
So, of course, it's hard to come up with sweeping generalizations as one major factor that is driving conflict. We have to contextualize case studies, look at specific context, specific cases, and try to analyze as much as we can without determinism, which is one factor leading to everything, but more correlation, different type of correlations. My problem was the Western perception that everything in the Middle East had to do with Islam, that it was born out of basically a problem with Islam. Islam is not compatible with democracy, is the main Orientalist narrative. Islam is conducive to radicalization. Islam is not open to modernity. Maybe Islam is not very compatible with capitalism. So there is this almost lazy, essentialist generalization, obsessed with civilizational identity. And the roots of that go back to Huntington's analysis, The Clash of Civilizations, because Huntington argued that when the Cold War came to an end, the new conflicts in the post-Cold War era would not be driven by ideology, as it was during the Cold War, communism versus capitalism, but they would be driven by religion, civilizational identity. And of course, this was a very broad, sweeping generalization, but it was in harmony with what culturalists always believed, that culture is the essence of everything. And if you want to understand a nation, if you want to understand a civilization, you have to focus on culture, this nebulous, vague notion of culture. How you define culture, according to Huntington, was very much based on religion. And the book made that case. There was another book written at the end of the Cold War that argued that the new conflicts would not be ideological or religious, that in fact there would not be any conflicts anymore, that we would converge towards a kind of democratic capitalist future. And that was, of course, the end of history argument by Fukuyama. So I started with this analysis which are basically two big names, Fukuyama and Huntington, trying to predict what would happen in the 21st century, what kind of drivers would emerge. And I have to say, I think academics, policy think tanks did not buy into the civilizational clash argument of Huntington. There was a lot of belief in the fact that there would be a convergence, like Fukuyama predicted and assumed, towards democratic capitalism. Simply put, the reason was that there was no alternative in this kind of Hegelian paradigm. You need to have an antithesis to the thesis for a new synthesis to emerge. What is the antithesis to capitalism and democracy? What can really confront capitalism and democracy as China is becoming more capitalistic, as Russia is becoming, with the end of the Soviet Union, more capitalistic and democratic with Yeltsin? This was pre-Putin, of course, in the 1990s. And there was a lot of hope that there would be a new China and a new Russia that would become responsible stakeholders in this rules-based liberal international order. The United States believed that China and Russia would converge towards becoming liberal democracies sooner or later. It would take time, but that the future was a capitalist and democratic future. That was the belief. And then 9/11 happened. 9/11 changed everything in the West, especially in the United States, and all of a sudden it reminded people of what Huntington argued, that there will be confrontation, wars, clashes based on religious identity. And of course, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was very religious. It was a jihadist movement, and the emergence of it had to do with political dynamics in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. There were two allies of the United States, and there was a lot of soul searching in the United States about, okay, what went wrong? What happened? Bernard Lewis, who was this guy, this old historian, who was no longer really a trendsetter in Middle Eastern studies. It was the world now of Edward Said. Orientalism was still dominant. All of a sudden, Bernard Lewis came back with the book, What Went Wrong, the argument that there is something about Islam that the West doesn't understand. And it was as if the Clash of Civilization, which everyone poo-pooed when it was published, had become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it was turning into reality. So that's the environment in which I think a lot of Westerners started to look at what's going on in the Middle East through the lens of Islam, that there is this political Islam issue, that Islamists are gaining ground in the Middle East, and they're gaining ground for a number of reasons. But some of them have to do with the fact that, the region is stuck. The region is unable to really transcend this paradigm of authoritarianism, and autocrats were using political Islam in order to stay in power. They were portraying Islam as really the big problem, and they were gaining ground. So you had a lot of neoconservative people in the Bush administration who argued that, we need to actually understand what's going on in the Middle East. And they focused on political Islam. They focused on Islam. They tried to understand the radicalization. Why do they hate us? Is it something about religion? And oftentimes the debate was very superficial. There was an attempt to understand, the roots of this anger about the West. And people like Bernard Lewis started to argue that you have to read the Quran, you have to understand the kind of political nature of Islam, that Islam is a political religion. Unlike Christianity, there is no separation of the realm of God and the realm of the state, that it's one. The state and Islam is one, and that this is an impediment, a structural impediment to secularism, but not only secularism, to democratization, to modernization, sometimes to economic development. So this is the context in which I think the West, especially the conservative segments, And the people who were not familiar with the West started to look at the Middle East, and the only thing they could see was jihadism, radical Islam, Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, and radicalized second and third generation Muslims in Europe, who played a major role in 9/11. Some of them were Muslims from Europe who were citizens of these countries. And there were, of course, terrorist attacks in Spain, in London, in France, that only also exacerbated this fear that there is this rise of Europe as a jihadist factory, that this second and third generation of radicalized Islamists are emerging. And there was a backlash against multiculturalism in Germany, in France, even in the UK, in Holland. And all this led me to think, as someone who was teaching about Muslims in Europe, that the West is obsessed with the wrong problem, that they're basically focusing on Islam. And this came to me very clearly when one of my students asked a question about my syllabus. There was this section on radicalism in the Middle East and in Europe. And he said, "Professor, you're talking about radicalism, but your reading list does not have anything on the Quran. We should be reading the Quran to understand why they are radicals." And then I realized these guys are watching, these are young students, but they're watching Fox TV. They're watching basically this nationalist, conservative, populist analysis. They're reading a lot about, the rise of political Islam as the main problem, without understanding the social, political, and most importantly, economic problems. The economic problems, the class issues. So that's why I think the West, especially the less informed segments of the West, the more conservative segments of the West, have the wrong idea that what fuels radicalization, what fuels conflict in the Middle East is not nationalism, is not, political, social, economic dynamics, but it's culture, it's religion, it's civilizational identity. And there was even an attempt to look at the Israeli-Palestinian problem as a problem of Hamas. What is Hamas? Hamas is political Islam. It's not Palestinian nationalism, it's Islamism. What is Hezbollah? Hezbollah is about political Islam. It's not about, nationalism. It's not Lebanese nationalism. It's Islam. What is Iran doing? What is Iran's foreign policy? It's Islam. What is Saudi Arabia's foreign policy? Well, Saudi Arabia's foreign policy is also driven by Islam, Wahhabism. So there was this perception that the real issue, the only game in town, if you will, in the Middle East is Islam. Of course, I'm caricaturizing. This is a kind of gross generalization, but I could see this emerging as the analysis of right-wing, superficial point of view about the Middle East and Muslims in Europe. And I wanted to challenge this by bringing two different levels of analysis: governance, the issue of political, social, economic governance, and the role of nationalism. Because the West is very familiar with nationalism. The West invented nationalism. But somehow they look at the Middle East, they look at the Muslim world, and they're obsessed with the fact that in a Muslim community, in an ideal Muslim context, there should be an ummah, that it should be pan-Islamic, that the brotherhood is about, the brotherhood of all Muslims, that there is no nationalism. But in fact, in reality, the Arab world has 22 countries. The Muslim world has 57 countries or more. And these are all practicing different types of Islam, different interpretations of the same culture. They have different languages, different sects, different social, political, economic models, which creates nation states. There are nation states in the Muslim world, and Turkey is one of them, perhaps the oldest nation state. And Malaysia, Indonesia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco. We have to contextualize all this, and let's not think about this Islam as a monolithic block and the Ummah as this imagined community that would drive everything in the Muslim world. So that's I think what I wanted to challenge with my analysis.
And you also look at nationalism as a more useful lens for understanding Middle Eastern politics and Turkish politics in particular. You use Turkey as a case study. So could you maybe elaborate further on that?
Sure. So part of the problem with cultural analysis and over-analysis of religion, overemphasis of religion, is the analysis on Turkey, which sometimes is obsessed with the secular versus Islamist dichotomy. And I think Bernard Lewis, once again, has a lot to do with that, because he's been a big believer that, Atatürk's main revolution was secularism in Turkey. And it's true, there is a dimension of secularism in Atatürk's understanding of modernity. After all, there's a reason why the Kemalists, Young Turks, were perceived as the Jacobins of the Turkish political spectrum, because they believed that there was something that was problematic about Islam, and they wanted to reform or privatize Islam to a certain degree. But when it comes to analyzing modern Turkey, in the book, I wanted to emphasize that the success of Erdogan is not only about Islam. There is an element of Islam, of course, in Erdogan's message, and he wants to balance the kind of radical secularist project of Atatürk with a more moderate version of separation of religion and state. He's not definitely a in the sense of the Middle East, a typical Islamist. He has to behave and engage in politics within the Turkish framework of accepting secularism as a constitutional principle. And Turkey is by far the most secular constitutional system in the Muslim world. The Turkish constitution and the Kemalist civilizational project is heavily influenced by France and Europe. But there is also an element of nationalism in Atatürk's project. And in fact, the success of Turkey is not just secularism, but this nationalist identity of Turkey. The fact that it assimilated all Muslim minorities into a Turkish civic identity. But there's one minority in Turkey where the assimilation did not really work, and that's the Kurdish minority. 20% of Turkey is Kurdish, and overall, the attempt to assimilate the Kurds, to basically deny the ethnic existence, cultural existence, linguistic existence of Kurdish identity, has failed. And this has created a lot of problem with Turkish nationalism and Kurdish nationalism. There has been a polarization. And if you want to understand Erdogan in a way, you also need to understand how he managed to use this Kurdish question, this Kurdish issue, to in foreign policy in Syria, for instance, but also in his relations with Europe. Just recently, in the last couple of years, he blocked Sweden's accession to NATO on the grounds that Sweden is too tolerant of Kurdish PKK group. Turkey's relations with the United States nosedive because of the Kurdish issue in Syria. So I wanted to emphasize that if you want to understand modern Turkey, you have to understand how Erdogan is using nationalism and how Turkish nationalism is able to transcend the secular Islamist divide. On many levels, secularists and Islamists in Turkey agree on Turkish nationalism. Even the Islamist segments of Turkey, they're not naively, romantically, idealistically believers in the Ummah. They believe in this project called Ottomanism, Neo-Ottomanism. And Neo-Ottomanism is about the primacy of the Ottoman state. And the Ottoman state is a Turkish state, in their opinion. So when Erdogan was promoting the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, when he was so hopeful about what was going on in Egypt, what was going on in Tunisia, he believed that Turkey would be the big brother. Turkey would be the kind of the superior country, the leader country in the Middle East. And there was a lot of nationalism in this project, a nationalism that appealed to many Turks, not just Islamists, but even secular Turks were proud of Turkey's growing role in the world, in the Middle East, but also in the form of strategic autonomy in foreign policy. A Turkey that is more powerful, a Turkey that can basically finally become a regional superpower and talk to the West almost in equal terms as a powerful country. This was a kind of neo-imperial project. And I saw how my friends, secular friends, French-speaking, English-speaking, German-speaking in the Turkish Foreign Service, were basically fascinated by the figure of Ahmet Davutoğlu, this kind of ideologue of neo-Ottomanism, which, yes, there was religion in his vision, but there was also a strong dose of Turkish nationalism. So in the book, what I argue is that sometimes we are obsessed with secular versus Islamist in analyzing Turkey, and we don't understand the power of Erdogan, the appeal of his message, by basically using the Kurdish question, by using history, by using this almost, I call it Gaullist tradition in France, transfer to Turkey, Turkish Gaullism, just like Charles de Gaulle in France, who wanted to speak about, the lost glory, the grandeur, the independence, the sovereignty of France. Erdogan was representing the lost glory, the return of the grandeur, the independence, the sovereignty, the strategic autonomy of Turkey. And Turkey was becoming almost like a non-aligned country. It was a NATO member, it was part of the West, but it was not a happy member of the West. The European Union was saying no to Turkey, especially starting by 2010. There was this sense of frustration with Europe as well. So this was a lot of nationalist energy, nationalist frustration, and Erdogan transferred this nationalist frustration and energy of Turkey into a political project. It was not just political Islam, it was religious nationalism. It was Turkish nationalism infused with religion. So it was an interesting synthesis of religion and nationalism. And it appealed to many secularists too, who basically believed that we should come to terms in a peaceful way with the fact that we are a Muslim country, that we should stop pretending we are France in the Middle East. We're Muslim. We're not Jacobin. We're not that really Western. The West is saying no to us. We may as well embrace and make peace with our identity and call it an Ottoman identity, be proud of our past, and not focus only on Ataturk's glory, but focus also on the glory of the last Sultan, Abdülhamid II. Abdülhamid II, which was the last of the great sultans, had a major comeback, and a lot of Turks rediscovered the Ottoman history. And that was nationalism, in my opinion. It was not just Islam. On top of that, as a second layer, there is the success of governance of Erdogan. I grew up in the Turkey of the 1990s. The 1990s was a lost decade for Turkey. Inflation was 70% on average. Turkey was at war with the PKK. There was political instability every year. We had in 10 years, maybe 12 different governments. And compared to the 1990s, the next decade, to 2002 to 2012, that next decade is a decade of success for Turkey. And it's mainly the success of Erdogan. On economic terms, Turkey exporting much more, Turkey becoming an economic powerhouse, Turkey engaging in basically a economic industrial manufacturing boom and an export-led model. And we have to emphasize that Turkey is lucky because it doesn't have natural resources. It doesn't have oil. It doesn't have energy or minerals, which means it needs productivity. It needs to export. It needs to actually produce a middle class and a capitalist class. And this was the decade of foreign direct investment, good relations with the Middle East, good relations with Europe, Turkey establishing a more democratic system based on rule of law, attracting foreign direct investment, and income per capita and GDP almost tripled in 10 years. So Turks witnessed a significant increase in their living standards. The infrastructure of Turkey, roads, telecommunication, health, education, all these metrics of governance, metrics of quality of life, from education to health, from infrastructure to economic productivity, increased. That's the story of Erdogan in the first decade, from 2002 to 2013. And without understanding that economic governance success and incremental democratization of Turkey, the establishment of civilian supremacy over the military, institutional changes, attempts to come to terms with the history, the Armenian genocide, the Kurdish problem, those were all big achievements of the first decade of Erdogan. There was a big debate about, the Kurdish question. There was a big debate about normalization of relations with Armenia. And all these things, I think, contributed to Erdogan's success. And they have nothing to do with Islam. Islam becomes part of the story with the Arab Spring and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and Erdogan basically establishing a hegemonic monopolization of power against the military in Turkey. That's when Erdogan feels more empowered, and he's returning to a certain degree, his old days of the Muslim Brotherhood after 2013, 2014, 2015. So, but the first decade of Erdogan's success has almost nothing to do with Islam. And also the fight between Erdogan and the Fethullah Gülen movement, which is a big problem in Turkey in terms of understanding the power dynamics, this clash between two Islamic movements. The Gülen movement is an Islamic movement. Erdogan also, if you want, is a politician that comes from the Brotherhood. That has nothing to do with Islam versus secularism. That's two Islamic forces, leaders fighting against each other. It has nothing to do with secularism or Islam. That too is about governance. It's about politics. So, in a nutshell, I think to understand Turkey, we need to just look beyond just Islam and secularism. We need to understand the power of good governance, good economic and political projects, especially in the first 10 years of Erdogan, and the power of nationalism and religious nationalism infused with religion, this Ottomanism. And that, to me, is the secret to understanding in a more sophisticated way Erdogan's project. Today, we can argue that, Islam played a major role during the Arab Spring in the Turkish support of the Muslim Brotherhood. But look at Erdogan today. He's making peace with the United Arab Emirates. He's making peace with Mohammed bin Salman. He's a pragmatic politician. If there was no war in Gaza, I'm sure Turkey would make peace with Netanyahu too. Erdogan made peace with the leader of Egypt, Abdel Fattah Sisi. He's a pragmatic politician. I think Erdogan lost his project to empower the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East because the Muslim Brotherhood failed. And he has turned to a more pragmatic, middle-of-the-road, realpolitik foreign policy. And today, if there is a decline in Erdogan's popularity, if we're talking about Erdogan being challenged more and more, it's not because all of a sudden there is a more secular Turkey emerging. It's not a secularist backlash only. There is an element of secular backlash against him, but primarily it's the failure also of governance. More corruption, more inflation, the failure of institutions, the collapse of rule of law, all the things that went well during the first 10 years, in the second 10 years started to go in the wrong direction. Corruption is back, bad governance is back, economic problems are back, the Kurdish conflict is back. So we have to understand that this has very little to do with Islam versus secularism. It has a lot to do with governance and nationalism.
And now this takes us to the next case study and argument. And you look at the Sunni Shiite or Sunni Shia conflict, and you give a different analysis to the one that is misconceived, perhaps. So could you maybe elaborate on that as well?
Happy to. So it's in continuity with my emphasis on governance and nationalism. There is a tendency in the West, among popular columnists like Tom Friedman, for instance, from the New York Times, to say, if you want to understand the Sunnis and Shiites fighting against each other, you have to go back to the 7th century. It's as if these people are still fighting the same war since the 7th century. And I had this question in my mind. I wish I could ask it to Tom Friedman himself. Let's say Muslims, by a miracle, decide that there should not be any conflict about, who succeeded the Prophet. That the 7th century schism between, Shiites and Sunnis is solved. That we basically are in agreement now. There is no longer any theological or historical debate about the 7th century. Would Saudi Arabia today and Iran all of a sudden say, fine, finally we can have peace. We have settled this big problem, this theological problem of the 7th century. Of course, I'm being ironic and sarcastic a little bit, but it's as if, in political science terms, the wars in the Middle East today between Sunnis and Shiites are ancient tribal conflicts, that they're deeply rooted. You have to understand the centuries old hatred that existed between Sunnis and Shiites. And I said, wait a minute. Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in almost everywhere in the Middle East, didn't they have peaceful times of coexistence? Wasn't there intermarriage in Beirut, in Baghdad, between Sunnis and Shiites? Wasn't there really times when actually there was no conflict? If this conflict has to do so much with the DNA of who they are, wouldn't it be permanent? Wouldn't they be always fighting? How can we explain the times when actually there was coexistence, the emergence of an almost civic identity that transcends the sectarian Sunni Shiite identities? And those times are, of course, times when you have a strong state that is able to provide good governance, which means security, capacity, and legitimacy. This is where I developed this concept of governance. A state that is able to provide security, a state that is able to provide capacity, economic development, a state that is able to have legitimacy is a strong state. When you have a strong state, historically, a state that is able to provide security for its citizens, economic development, and a state that is gaining popularity, legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens, is a legitimate state. Under these states, usually you have coexistence of different minorities. It is when the state is unable to provide security, when there's an institutional collapse of the state, that people turn to their identities, turn to their family, turn to their tribe, turn to their ethnic sectarian religious identity for protection, for security, because there is no longer a state that is able to provide the most important element of governance, security. What is the definition of a state? Max Weber's definition of a state is an entity that is able to legitimately monopolize the use of violence. If a state is unable to legitimately monopolize the use of violence, that state is at the mercy of different tribes, militias, sects fighting with each other. The collapse of the state. And who are these militias? Who are these tribes fighting? They're often defined by identity, by religious, ethnic, sectarian identities. So the key here is to understand when there's a collapse of the state, there's a collapse of governance, collapse of security, collapse of capacity. And the sectarian divide in the Middle East, in Iraq, the sectarian divide in the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, when you think about it, is often the product of the collapse of the state, a security collapse, a capacity collapse, and of course, a legitimacy collapse. So these states that were basically managing to keep this entity together, when they are collapsing, in the case of Iraq because of an American invasion, in Syria because of the rebellion, in Yemen because of a civil war, in Lebanon because of the dysfunctional system of governance, you have in those kind of contexts a Sunni sectarian division, a Sunni Shiite civil war that is often fueled by whom? Who is fueling this war? Well, there is an Iranian factor and often a Sunni Arab factor as well. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are often, with their imperialistic nationalist agendas, because these are two states. They may have Islam as their major facade, their title, but there is something called Arab nationalism, Saudi nationalism, and Iranian nationalism, Persian nationalism. These are two states that are competing for primacy in the region. That has nothing to do really with the 7th century dynamics. It has everything to do with modern dynamics of nationalism, geostrategic power, projection of an imperial project, an imperial vision. Saudi Arabia and Iran are not medieval states. They're modern states. They're using modern methods. They have proxies. They have their agendas. And they're basically engaged in this struggle for primacy in the Middle East in places where governance has collapsed. In Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Yemen. These are the 4 countries that I looked at. And I said, if you want to understand the conflict in these regions, you can look at the way the West does sometimes on, it's all about Sunni and Shiite ancient tribal hatred. They hate each other. And these people have been fighting each other since time immemorial. By the way, the West had a similar analysis of the Yugoslavia dynamics of the Balkans. They looked at the Balkans and the Croats and the Serbs and the Bosniaks as ancient tribal hatred too. It was not ancient tribal hatred. It was modern nationalism, mobilized by ethnic entrepreneurs like Milosevic in the Balkans. And in the context of Iraq, it was mobilized by modern ethnic entrepreneurs on the Sunni front and Shiite front. These are guys very well aware of what they want to do. They're using religion, they're instrumentalizing religion for a political purpose. So what I wanted to disprove in the book is that what appears to be this sectarian, deeply rooted ancient war, conflict, in fact, has a lot to do with the collapse of modern institutions, the state, and how nationalist dynamics and ethnic entrepreneurs are constructing the conflict. They're reconstructing the conflict. They basically have a political vision. They're using religion. Religion is part of it, but religion is not the engine, the source of the conflict. Religion is instrumentalized. That's how they mobilize people. But at the heart of it, the real driver of the conflict is often social, economic, political, nationalist dynamics, and they use religion. Religion is important, religion is relevant, but let's not focus on religion as the source of the problem, as the driver of problem. Religion is often an instrument used by nationalist visions, interested in material power, interested in political power. And it's a modern phenomena that gains strength when there's a collapse of institutions. That's how I looked at Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. And I tried to portray this as, here is an alternative way of analyzing what the West is calling the Sunni Shiite sectarian debate, wars. Let's focus on governance and nationalism, and let's right size the role of religion in this. Religion is important, but it's not the only game in town. Religion is part of the story. It's often not the cause of the problem, it's the result to a certain degree. And it's very visible. Religion is very visible. What is less visible are the institutional, political, social, and nationalist dynamics behind religion.
And you also look at the ISIS situation as a case study in the book. And in that light, how do economic underdevelopment and political repression fuel radicalization more than ideology?
So in the book, I look at radicalization through different prisms. There is one camp in the West that believes radicalization has a lot to do with Islam, with ideology, with culture. And they've obsessed with, let's read the Quran, let's understand Salafism, let's understand jihadism. In the French debate, which I'm very familiar to, there's this big division between Gilles Kepel, who is more of a scholar of the text, let's read the text, and Olivier Roy, who is more of a scholar of let's understand the context. The text is not everything, context is everything. And let's try to understand the role of, social, political, psychological, global dynamics in this conflicts, in this radicalization process. And I'm much more in the Olivier Roy camp of trying to understand context rather than reading the text, reading religious texts, trying to understand the religious roots. I have respect for that school. You can do it, but without understanding the broader context, you're missing a lot in terms of radicalization. The problem with some of the left-wing progressive scholars is that just like the right wing is obsessed with culture, the left wing is obsessed only with social, economic, class dynamics. They say poverty and lack of education. Economic problems and educational problems are fueling radicalization. And it's not as simple as that. We should not have the answer to cultural determinism should not be economic determinism. So my approach to radicalization in general is about avoiding economic or cultural determinism. Instead, it's looking at the problem without any deterministic monocausal approach, but to include multiple drivers, correlations, to look at political, social, cultural, psychological dynamics in a larger context. So if we have that, for instance, we can look at the role of the problem of lack of education or economic problems, not just as a education or political or underdevelopment problem, but we can look at a kind of relative deprivation problem. It's not a deprivation problem, but it's relative deprivation. It's expectations relative to opportunities that is causing radicalism. In a country like Egypt, in a country like Tunisia, when you have educated unemployment, for instance, you have a lot of people who are not just poor. They are middle class or lower middle class, and they're getting education. They have higher expectations, higher aspirations, but their expectations, their aspirations are unmet. There's a frustration because as they're growing more enthusiastic, ambitious, with their aspirations and expectations, their frustrations grows because they see the reality under a different light. They know what's going on in the world. They know what's going on in the country. They can analyze things and they become basically educated but unemployed, educated but not very powerful politically. So this is the category of people that I call the frustrated achievers. The frustrated achievers of the Middle East, the frustrated achievers of Europe, among Muslim communities in Europe. Those are the people who sometimes have alienation, frustration, radicalization. They're becoming rebels, they're getting angry, and they're looking for a cause. They're looking for something to cling on, to attach themselves. And religion sometimes provides an angle. Religion provides maybe an identity, maybe an anchor for who they are, what they want, a kind of political project. How all this relates to ISIS? It relates to ISIS in the following way. First of all, we need to understand the role of the economy and the institutions in governance, and then look at Syria. What happened in Syria? In Syria, you had the collapse of the state. The collapse of the state, and just like in Iraq, you had the collapse of the state, and you had the Sunni identity of Iraq and the Sunni identity of Syria entering a moment of existential angst, existential anxiety about who are going to represent the Sunnis. In Iraq, who are the Sunnis protected by? And the Sunnis felt that there was this Iranian Shiite hegemony emerging, and they felt disempowered, they felt disenchanted, they felt alienated, they felt frustrated. So on top of that, you had the collapse of the state, and you had basically in the collapse of the state, anarchy emerging, people turning to their identities. And I argue that in the context of Syria, the collapse of the state that led to anarchy created a vacuum. There was a vacuum that needed to be filled. You know, nature abhors, hates vacuums, and you need to fill the vacuum. So the vacuum of the collapse of the state was filled by this Sunni anger, Sunni frustration. In Syria, which is 70% Sunni, the Sunnis basically felt that, you know, the Alevites, the regime supported by Russia, supported by Iran, was crushing them. And there was this existential anxiety, existential threat perception. And here comes basically a jihadist Sunni organization that says two things. A, I can protect you. I will protect you. B, there is anarchy here. There's a collapse of the state. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There is no institution. I can provide institutions. I will provide a state. I am creating a state. I will monopolize the use of violence. I will tax people. I will create institutions. There will be water. There will be electricity. There will be food at your table. But it will be not rule of law, but rule by law. And rule by law, it will be Sharia. It will be the most, primitive, the most primordial, the most, fundamentalist Sharia possible. And I will provide order. It will be a brutal order with medieval dimensions of violence, but I will provide order. I will protect you from the Shiite, Iranian, Persian, these people who are killing us, and I will not only protect you, but I will also put food on the table. I will provide electricity. I will provide water. I will provide roads. But you give me your tax. I'm creating a state, hence the Islamic State. So my analysis of ISIS is not just this religious zeal and this emerges out of nowhere of this fundamentalist, brutal regime. It's basically a collapse of governance and the emergence of a state that has this kind of fundamentalist characteristics. And who is building this state? Yes, Sunni nationalists, and not just fundamentalists, but the vanguard, the military power of ISIS did not come from these guys on trucks. It came from the Ba'athist generals who provided a sense of military strategy. Tactical and operational success of ISIS in battles came from Ba'athist officers of Iraq joining ISIS, why wouldn't Ba'athist officer, someone under Saddam, who basically was probably a whiskey drinking, secular guy, join ISIS? It's the Sunni identity of ISIS against basically the Shiites, against this Iranian, Persian project that was fueling the rise of ISIS. And who are joining ISIS? A lot of second-generation Muslims from Belgium, from France, from Britain. Some of these kids, as they were traveling to Istanbul and taking the bus to Gaziantep and crossing the border to Syria, had books in their luggage, in their bags, titled Islam for Dummies. They were just reading about Islam. What is this religion? They were just kids who were basically in Europe. A few months ago, maybe they were drinking, flirting, doing drugs. They go to jail for shoplifting. They spend a few months in jail. They meet a religious guy in jail who turns them into, Salafists. And then they get out, and all of a sudden they have this kind of born-again Muslim identity. They're kind of converts to Islam almost. They have the zeal of the convert, zealousness of the convert. They want to prove that we can be more Muslim than others. And how do you prove your Muslim fundamentalist Salafi credentials? You go to Syria to see the future, just like communists in Italy, when Mussolini was in power, they went to Moscow to see the future, communism, right? They go to Syria to see what an Islamic state is about, what is Sharia is about. They are looking for adventure. Some of them bring their families even. They basically establish there a new life. And that's not just about Islam. This has so many layers in it. It's alienation, frustration, social, economic, political, psychological dynamics, governance dynamics, and nationalism, Sunni religious nationalism of the Ba'athist officers. My analysis of ISIS in that sense was a challenge to this Western perception of ISIS as purely a jihadist movement that has emerged because for some reason the Syrians or the Iraqis wanted more religion. For some reason they wanted more Islam. It's not that. ISIS played a role that should be analyzed in the context of governance and the role of Sunni disempowerment and Sunni nationalism. So in a nutshell, that's my analysis of ISIS.
Yeah, and a follow-up question on that, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while now. So you have hundreds and thousands of people flying into Turkey, taking a bus to Gaziantep, and then from Gaziantep crossing over to Syria. So my question, or the puzzle here, is how did the Turks, or how the Turkish intelligence let that happen? I mean, they must have known. It's not like it was tens of people; it was hundreds, perhaps thousands. So how does that fit in that image?
So the easy and short answer is that the Turkish intelligence collaborated with the Al-Qaeda and the jihadist Salafist movements. The people who are ruling Syria today, the Hayat Tahrir Sham, these guys were al-Nusra before, and al-Nusra had tacit and sometimes arguably active support on the part of Turkey. Why would the Turkish government support jihadist groups in Syria? And the reason is because the jihadist groups, once Russia and Iran started supporting the regime in Syria, in the eyes of Turkey, the only way to fight effectively, first the regime, but more importantly, the Kurdish nationalists in the northern part of Syria that wanted to create an autonomous Kurdish state. The best way to fight them was to support the jihadist groups. Turkey's initial policy in Syria was to support the Muslim Brotherhood, the more moderate Islamic groups. But as that transformed into a more radical Islamic rebellion, more radical elements started gaining ground against the Assad regime, Turkey basically found itself in a position where it had to see who it could support in this war. And if you want to have regime change in Syria, if you want to topple the Assad regime, and if you want to defeat the Kurdish project in the north, your best allies became the jihadists. And Erdogan, in that sense, thought that maybe he can control this jihadist rebellion by co-opting them. He didn't want to be really in a project where he would support the jihadization of Syria. He didn't want a jihadist government in Syria, but he thought that the jihadists were the most efficient fighters against the regime and the Kurdish militia that the United States started to support because they were the fighters against ISIS. So Turkey, in a way, found itself not squarely in the same camp as ISIS, but in the camp of political Islam and the Islamist forces fighting the regime in Aleppo, in other parts of Syria, but also fighting the Kurds in what the Kurds call Rojava. That meant turning a blind eye to religious, Islamist, jihadist fighters crossing the border from Turkey to Syria. And you have to imagine, if you're basically a young, radicalized, alienated Muslim of France or Belgium or the United Kingdom, going to Syria is not like going to Afghanistan to fight the global jihad. All you have to do is to jump on a charter flight to Istanbul, take the bus to Gaziantep, and in a few hours, you're in Syria. The Turkish government basically will turn a blind eye. And not only that, there would be re-entry to Turkey. Wounded soldiers would come back to Turkey and would be treated in Turkish hospitals. For years, Erdogan government turned basically a blind eye, and that was tacit support, sometimes active support for organizations like Al-Nusra, for organizations that represented jihadist resistance against Bashar Assad and the Kurdish movement. The Kurdish movement in Syria was directly linked to the PKK. So for Erdogan, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of the Kurds and the enemy of Bashar Assad is my friend. And this actually turned into a nightmare for Turkish-American relations, because the United States was supporting the Kurds, Turkey's existential threat, and Turkey was supporting Al-Qaeda, basically jihadist, America's existential threat. Good luck saving the strategic partnership between two NATO allies when you're actively supporting each other's existential threat. No wonder CENTCOM, American soldiers in Pentagon, they started hating Turkey. They started thinking they're in bed with terrorists. And Turkey kept saying to the United States, you are in bed with Kurdish terrorists. And Americans were saying, no, you are supporting terrorists. And that's the problem of terrorism. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And terrorism is this nebulous project. For America, the Kurds were fighting terrorism, ISIS. For Turks, the Kurds themselves were terrorists, and Turkey was supporting a religious movement, religious groups against the real terrorists. The problem is that existential threat matters, right? Existential threat perception for Turkey was Kurdish nationalism, Kurdish problem. For America, it was jihadism, ISIS. And that's where Turkish-American relations really diverted. And to make things worse, for Turkey to intervene in northern Syria, Turkey had to engage in a bargain with the country that controlled northern Syria. Who controlled northern Syria? Not the United States. Russia controlled northern Syria. Russia had a military base. Russia owned the skies, the airspace. So for Turkey to engage in serious military operation that turned into a full invasion of northern Syria, pockets of northern Syria. Turkey needed to get the green light from Russia, from Putin. That was the beginning of a new kind of relationship between Russia and Turkey, which was crowned by Turkey purchasing a missile defense system from Russia, which was the S-400 missile defense system, which led to Turkey's ouster from the F-35 project, which only exacerbated Turkish-American relations. So if you want to understand the story of how Turkey and the United States really turned into enemies in Syria, you have to understand all these contextual dynamics.
Indeed, and maybe briefly, if you could elaborate on this part, so we could have time for the other questions. How do you operationalize or define existential? Because for me, I feel like it's quite overblown to define the Kurdish question or label a Kurdish militia as existential to a state such as Turkey with its institutions, with its military. I mean, it's almost really insignificant militarily, economically, in almost all aspects. So I'm really curious why and how you frame it as existential.
So the Turkish nationalists frame it as existential. The people who are progressive liberal Democrats, just like you did, believe that the problem is just a problem of cultural, ethnic identity, that it can easily be dealt with without any existential threat perception by giving them cultural rights and some level of decentralization. It could easily be handled with cultural rights and decentralization. But in the narrative of nationalism, which I deal with in the book, nationalism perceives the Kurdish nationalism as an existential threat because Turkish nationalism is born out of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So in the eyes of Turkish nationalists, when they see the Kurds and their demands for cultural rights, they don't see it as innocuous demands for just cultural existence. They basically say, this is how we lost an empire. It starts with this. It starts with this cultural rights, but then it gets into political rights, decentralization, autonomy, separatism, independence. It started like that with the Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Albanians, the Armenians, the Arabs. We lost an empire like that. And if we give the Kurds what they want, we have other ethnic groups in Turkey. We have in Turkey more Albanians than in Albania, more Chechens than in Chechnya. If everyone embarks on a nationalist project of demanding Albanian, Chechen, cultural rights, political rights, we will end up with a total disintegration of the Turkish Republic. That's their narrative. In reality, of course, there is no such thing as Albanian nationalism in Turkey, or Bosnian nationalism, or Chechen nationalism. Yes, we have more people who identify as Bosnian roots or Albanian roots or Chechen roots in Turkey, but they're perfectly happy to be Turkish citizens because they migrated from these regions and assimilated to Turkish identity. The Kurds have not.
And let's go back to the book. And so, why does the West consistently misread the Middle East, and how do these misconceptions shape its policies?
So, the problem is primarily that the West has an easy and lazy reading of what's going on in the Middle East. The easy and lazy reading of the Middle East is that there are a bunch of radicals, Islamists there, and we need basically stability in the Middle East. Who is providing stability? The strongmen are providing stability. In the past, it was Mubarak. Now it's Sisi. In Tunisia, in Algeria, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. If we don't have these autocrats, the alternative would be political Islam. And this is an easy and lazy analysis, and it's fueled by the regimes in the region. What was Mubarak known for? Mubarak in Egypt was known for saying to the Europeans or the Americans, you can criticize me. You can say, I'm not perfect in terms of democracy, human rights, etc. But who is my alternative? If you're not happy with me, who would come to power in Egypt? Look behind my shoulder. You see these guys with the beard, the Islamists? Do you want them to come to power? It's either me or them. Make your choice. And in reality, they would say, of course, there is a third alternative. It's not a binary alternative. There is a third alternative. There are actually people who are in favor of democracy, human rights, secularism, strong relations with the West, but they happen to be often in jail. They're not basically allowed to organize a political party. These governments in the Middle East are masters of basically selling themselves as modernizing autocrats, saying it will take time for modernity and democracy and secularism and good governance to emerge. You in the West had 300 years, 400 years to achieve that. Give me another decade. I'm going in that direction. Give me a little bit more money. I make peace with Israel. Cash, please. I keep down the radicals. Cash, please. You want destabilization? You want basically civil war? You want migration? You want refugees? Stick with me. I'm your best bet. That's the dynamic in the Middle East. So there is this tendency in the West to, in that sense, to look at friendly autocrats, to see these dynamics as these are the guys who are keeping basically the barbarians, the Islamists, apart. If we don't have them in power, it will be radical Islam, Islamist, the Muslim Brotherhood, jihadists who will come to power and they will make war with Israel. They will basically turn the country like Algeria into a civil war. This happened in Algeria, right? It will be a civil war. Look at Libya, a civil war. Destabilization in Syria. You will have millions of refugees. What the West is unable to understand is that this is not a sustainable system. You need to figure out a way to slowly improve governance dynamics in the Middle East. You need to improve governance. You need to create dynamics of representation, dynamics of rule of law, dynamics of party politics, dynamics of human rights and transparency and freedom of speech, what we call institutions that will create some level of good governance. And that requires calling the bluff of these autocrats and telling them, you're not going to get billions of dollars. You're not going to get that kind of support. We're not going to give you security support either unless you engage in incremental, not sudden, incremental steps towards not cosmetic liberalization, not civil society reforms. We're not talking about journalism programs or gender right programs in a country where there is no freedom of media or there is no real gender dynamics to talk of. We want political parties to emerge. We want freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of political parties to emerge, and an incremental calendar, 5 years, 10 years for local elections. Let's start with local elections. Let's start with basically elections for the municipality of Alexandria, municipality of Cairo, municipality of, big cities, and then slowly turn this with conditional assistance to a larger project of democratization. The West, in my opinion, instead of looking for, solutions related to supporting the autocrats or solutions related to finding alternatives to radical Islam, which is moderate Islam, a reformed Islam. Let's figure out the answer to radical Islam. If Islam is the problem, the solution can also be Islam in the form of a more progressive, more friendly Islam. There's this obsession that the best way of fighting radical Islam is by moderate Islam, by supporting basically moderate Islamists. No, it's about supporting rule of law, supporting political dynamics, supporting constitutionalism, supporting liberalism, supporting freedom of speech, institutions. The West should understand that they are the impediment. They are becoming an impediment to political change in the Middle East. If the Middle East is stuck in these authoritarian regimes, the West is complicit in this. The West is complicit, and the West should figure out a way to help the democratic activists, the liberals, the secular segments, the people who basically want change in the region, instead of buying the authoritarian narrative of it's either me or the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a third way. They happen to be often suppressed. And I think in that sense, my recommendation in the book is to promote incremental and conditional reforms, conditional assistance, conditional economic support for the region, especially countries that do not have oil, like Egypt, like Morocco, like Tunisia, Lebanon. All these countries can receive, Jordan can receive conditional support from the West, assistance from the European Union, for an incremental project of not democratization, but political liberalization, which means a constitutional rule that will allow for the emergence of political parties and not sudden elections. Because if you have elections in 2 years, 3 years, it will be the Muslim Brotherhood that will win. Let's allow time for liberal, democratic, center-left alternatives, progressive alternatives to emerge in the region. Freedom of speech, freedom of the media, journalism, rule of law, constitutional reform. These are the things that the West should support. But if we're obsessed with political Islam, and if we buy the narrative of autocrats in the region, we will always be in this binary dynamics of it's either authoritarian secular dynamics or Islamization in the form of democratization. Democratization would mean Islamization. We can avoid democratization turning into Islamization if we have an incremental liberalization project of incremental reforms, conditional reforms, and letting basically these voices that are alternatives to authoritarianism and alternatives to political Islam to emerge in the region. And I think there is a critical mass in the region, in the Middle East, that would support this third way between the autocratic regime and the Islamists.
And how can a balance be achieved? Let's think of the Europeans, for example. How can they balance their fears of mass migration, say the example of Egypt, for example, mass migration and energy needs or potential energy needs?
Right. They will have to work. They will have to work with the autocrats, but they will have to pressure the autocrats. They will have to figure out that they have leverage. The European and American narrative is often one of, we have no leverage with the autocrats. They can do whatever they want. And it's an easy way of basically saying, we can't really do anything. But in reality, I think the European Union has the tools, the statecraft tools, to actually support change. Don't get me wrong. I don't think the West can change the Middle East. I don't think we can really socially engineer an opposition. In fact, the worst thing that can appear is that this third way can be perceived as basically supported by the West, and they are the basically Western voices, and they would be discredited as part of an imperialist project. This is why in the book I support basically not the United States taking the lead in this, but the European Union and also the World Bank and the United Nations, international multilateral organizations that will be very good at promoting basically governance reform. And they will not be tainted as a kind of Western imperial projects. As long as the World Bank can play a major role in these things. There could be a new multilateral bank. I call it the Mediterranean Development Bank. Let's create a Mediterranean Development Bank which has a lot of cash, supported by Japan, supported by the United States, supported by the European Union. And these financial incentives would support regimes in the region that take incremental steps towards liberalization. The balance that you're asking rightly is basically in this incremental approach. No one is saying suddenly bring a revolutionary change to the Middle East. The key, however, that the West needs to understand is that the current path of authoritarian stability is bound to fail. It's bound to explode with another Arab Spring, with another revolution, with another explosion of social frustration. Instead of this social revolution, frustration, alienation, let's have incremental steps that will allow the autocrats in the region to have a incremental and soft exit from the scene, that they wouldn't feel that if they lose power, they will lose their life. They will lose their basically everything. That there can be a future for them too, as people who facilitate this transition to a system. Let's not call it democracy, rule of law, transparency, good governance. Let's call it good governance, transition to good governance. In fact, the World Bank is not using the democracy word, the D word, it's using good governance. And that's what I use in the book too. I say governance. What we need is good governance, more than this democracy project or liberalism project. Let's call it good governance, which basically provides security, capacity, and legitimacy for these states.
Well, I wouldn't be too optimistic about the Europeans trying to use their leverage in Egypt. I mean, the 1 billion tranche of a 4 or 5 billion loan in the assessment, it was reported on. In the assessment, they said that there was incremental change and progress in the Egyptian democracy and human rights file, which is completely false. I mean, the situation in Egypt, this is the worst. It's been since 1952, basically.
You know why? Because they believe what the government is telling them. Because they have, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the details, but, what happened in Egypt was a clear case of what should be called a coup. And the West did not have the courage to call it a coup. Why? Because Egypt is a geostrategically important country, and the West will work with whoever is in power in Egypt. And the key here is to not believe the narrative of the regime, which will portray what they're doing as steps towards democracy. The European Union should say, let's not kid ourselves. You're not moving towards democracy. We know you're becoming increasingly more authoritarian. But here is the way out from this. It's a project of providing enough carrots, enough incentives, but also enough sanctions, sticks. It's a way of incentivizing Egypt. And it's up to Egypt at the end of the day. Maybe the leadership of Egypt would say, I don't want your economic assistance. I can always turn to my friends in the Gulf and try to get more money from the UAE or Saudi Arabia. This is why I think there should be a debate about, okay, what is the role of these regimes which are worried also about political Islam? Saudi Arabia, Emirates, etc. Let's engage them in a conversation also. What is this big fear that they have about the Muslim Brotherhood? Can it be addressed in a rational way? How can we avoid a future for the Arab world where there's this binary situation between the authoritarian system and the Muslim Brotherhood? Maybe they can be convinced also that there can be a third way of constitutional rule of law with incremental steps towards democratization. I'm an academic. I'm thinking about these things. Of course, in reality, there will be major policy implementation problems. But our jobs in the think tanks and in academia is to provide some options, some thinking about, what are the things that we can do. And I think it's high time for the West to stop believing the narrative coming from the regimes and to stop this obsession with Islam as the main issue in the Middle East, political Islam as the main issue. The main issue is not political Islam. The main issue is governance reform.
And this takes us to the next question. So how do Russia and China perceive the region differently?
Russia and China have no problem working with autocratic regimes, and they have their own fears of Islam. China is very worried about political Islam because they see their Uyghur problem as an Islamist issue as well. And Russia is very much concerned about the rise of political Islam in the Russian Federation in the south, in the North Caucasus. So their approach is to support authoritarian regimes. Russia and China cannot be part of any governance reform projects in the Middle East. They are just status quo players who would support deeply entrenched authoritarianism. So this is why it is important for the West to speak in the name of, reform, change. If the West, on top of Russia and China, becomes a believer in the status quo of authoritarian stability, then we have no hope of external help for reform. Not that I'm a strong believer that reform can come with external push, but at least the West should not become an impediment to change. The West should not be complicit in the authoritarian stability. It should help change in the region. It should start to provide visions. Russia and China are deeply entrenched authoritarian systems, and there is nothing more normal than authoritarian systems supporting other authoritarian systems.
And since the book's publication, how have its arguments played out in recent events in Syria, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Iran, the case of Hezbollah, and most importantly, Trump's second term?
I'm a strong believer that nationalism and governance are still very relevant in the problems of the region. Nationalism has become a major issue in the Middle East now, with the Palestinian nationalism issue in the form of, the fight in Gaza coming back to the agenda. It was forgotten. No one was talking about the Palestinian issue for a long time. With Hamas entering the picture, it reemerged as a problem, and it emerged as the problem of Palestinian statehood. Now we have to talk about the Palestinian state. So you can think of Hamas as a Islamist movement, and yes, there is an Islamist element in that, but I think Hamas is also a very important nationalist Palestinian movement. Religious nationalism. Why are there secular Palestinians who are also supporting Hamas? Because of the corruption of the, perhaps, Fatah, because of the corruption of the alternative in the West Bank. So governance matters. Governance in the Palestinian question really matters. What's going on in Israel? The governance problem of Israel, rule of law, what Netanyahu is doing. This is a governance issue. In the United States, the reemergence of Trump, it's not just a cultural issue. It's not just about LGBT. It's also about inflation. It's also about standards of living. It's the economy. So governance, the economy, capacity, security issues really matter. And in Syria, what we had was basically a collapsed state, a failed state, and that state was not able to have security or capacity. It was a kind of narcotic state that emerged in Syria with Assad, and it was not strong enough to defend itself from an Islamist takeover. And the Islamists who came to power, they're not pursuing a blind Islamist agenda. Look at what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham doing. They're trying to portray themselves as responsible, good governance reformers. They at least know that if they want foreign direct investment, if they want acceptance from the world, they need to provide good governance. And this means capacity, security, legitimacy for the Syrian people. So the state in Syria is reemerging. Governance is more relevant than ever. And I think the book's main thesis that if you want to understand Syria, you should not be obsessed about the Islamic identity of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but you should focus on whether this group can provide good governance and how can the West to figure out the way to slowly diminish the sanctions with conditions of good governance. The key to Syria today is to lift some of the sanctions with conditions of good governance. If they provide good governance, if they provide governance for representation for minorities, constitutional rule, some semblance of, transparency and pluralism, then the West should lift the sanctions on Syria. That's about governance. That's not about Islam. It's about governance. And in Turkey, Erdogan came close to losing an election. He lost the municipal election. Why did he lose these elections? It was because of inflation, because of corruption, because of bad governance. I think overall in the last 5 years, the issue of nationalism and governance, from the civil war in Sudan to problems between Egypt and Ethiopia, and the problems of Syria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Iran coming together. Why are they coming together? Why is there a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Is there a consensus emerging about the 7th century dynamics of the succession of the Prophet? Of course not. It's geostrategic dynamics. It's the perception that the United States is moving out of the region and that it is time for these two powers to figure out a way to coexist. Because if there's a war, the big loser of that war would be the governance reform project of the United Arab Emirates and Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia. It's about political, economic vision that is driving this rapprochement between between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are basically realizing that they need to understand the geostrategic context and they need to figure out a way to avoid war. This is about two nationalist primacy project coming to terms with coexistence in the region. Iran is weakened because of the war in Gaza, because of Hamas and Hezbollah taking a beating. And Saudi Arabia is gaining more and more ground. So to me, those are all related to geostrategic, nationalist, primacy issues and governance dynamics. So I think the book overall is providing still some relevant frameworks and explanations for understanding the current dynamics of the region.
Indeed. Any closing remarks or future projects you would like to highlight?
I think it's important to find the right balance, as you asked in your question. The West cannot be the engine of change in the Middle East, but the least it can do is not to be the obstacle to change in the region. So that's my closing remark. If the West can change the way it thinks about the region and try to understand the real structural, institutional, political challenges instead of this constant obsession with terrorism, refugees, or cultural dynamics, it would be a big step towards a better intellectual analysis of the region, and that could help some of the reformers in the region to actually gain more ground against authoritarian dynamics. They don't need the West to support them. They just need the West to stop supporting the authoritarian regimes.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Taşpınar, for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Of course.
I wish you best of luck.
Thank you. And to fellow listeners, I'll leave all the links to the book and to the professor's website on the description. And thank you so much for listening.